Welcome to Chapter 2, Part 2 of Research on Written Feedback. This part is going to talk about what research has shown so far and what works. Oddly enough, for something that teachers spend a lot of time doing, there hasn't been a lot of research on this area, especially around what kinds of feedback are the most effective for students who are writing in their first language. I will say that there is a lot of research in the area of second language learning around teachers' comments on writing, and some of that is really helpful, and some of it is quite different from the kinds of comments and support that students need when they're writing in their first language. We know from the research that teachers' comments do matter, thankfully, as we all always wonder. And even back as far as 1972, so before many of us were born, there was a study of students' responses to teachers' comments. And in this study, I had to share this quote because I think it's what we all feel. Guy wrote, "Teachers also spend countless hours writing comments on students' papers in the belief that their comments will bring about improvement in students' writing skills. However, in marking papers, the students' reactions are sometimes quite different from those that the teacher had expected or hoped for." And so because of probably feeling the exact same thing we all still feel over 40 years later, this researcher did a study where he divided students into 3 groups. One group received no comment on their paper. The next group received just criticism, and the third group received praise. And he found that the students who received praise wrote longer subsequent essays and showed a more positive attitude toward writing than those in the other 2 groups. So, there's a lot this study doesn't tell us. We don't really know if their essays were better, just that they were longer. We know a bit about their attitude, but at least we know that the teacher's comments didn't matter. We also, unfortunately, know that teachers' feedback sometimes causes miscommunications, and I'm sure we've all experienced this as teachers and also as people receiving feedback on our own writing. That sometimes teachers give contradictory messages in their comments. They'll say a passage needs a sentence condensed, but it also needs to be more specific or more developed. And that can be really confusing for students if they're not sure what feedback they're supposed to act on and how they should do that. Another researcher shared an example of a student's frustration when the student doesn't know what to fix when all the teacher writes is something like awkward or underlines a sentence without explaining what's wrong with it. And certainly we can all understand the teacher and the need to write short comments. Commenting takes so much time, but sometimes the downside of these short comments is that students misunderstand it or just don't know what to do with it. They're not very instructive. They're not very helpful. Sometimes comments can also take over the authorship of the writing, and I certainly fell into this trap as a teacher where I would be looking at a student's piece of writing and I knew it needed a lot of help, and I would find myself trying to help them, sometimes rewriting phrases or giving them ideas of examples from the text that they could use to add to their writing. And this quote I always found to be really useful for me. "Common types of response in which teachers cross out sentences or phrases and rewrite them for the student can have the effect of appropriating ownership of the text from the student. The teacher is no longer a reader, but a rewriter." And I found that to be really helpful for me in thinking about what kind of role I wanted to take as a giver of feedback. Was I seeing myself as someone who was rewriting the paper, or was I just sharing my experience as a reader so that my student could then take on the ownership of rewriting and revising? And for me, it also came down to an issue of time. I didn't have time to rewrite 150 essays. And so I really needed to share that ownership of the paper with the student. Sperling and Friedman also conducted a study where they looked at students' revisions in response to teachers' feedback and realized that whatever the teacher asked the student to do, the student did. They came to the conclusion that the student had a closely held assumption that the teacher's comments reflect his wiser perspective on writing. And for this reason, a student would do well to accept them always. I was really lucky in that I had an interesting experience the year that I was doing the teacher inquiry project, where one of my students called me over to her while she was revising and pointed to a comment that I had made and said to me, well, I know you want me to put such and such sentence here, but I don't want to do that. And I think it would work just as well in this part of the paragraph. And I realized that she was right. And I realized, who was I to tell her what exactly to do with her writing? And really what I could focus on was who I was as the responder and the experience that I had had reading the piece of writing. There's also research that shows about the effects of editing. And when I say editing, that's any kind of more close sentence level work that a teacher does for the students or helps the students to do around issues of grammar, mechanics, other kinds of conventions like following MLA or APA format, paragraphing, typing, formatting issues, all of those really close details. And in 1991, Dorr conducted a study and found that when the teachers focused too much on mechanical errors, that's what the students thought revising was. And I found this quote to be really useful. When 80% of the comments are on grammatical correctness, the writers will soon discover the genuine values of the commenter and will believe as well that editing is of utmost importance. And so for me, as a teacher who really wanted my students to focus on revising rather than editing, after I read this study and a few others, I was feeling like perhaps I wanted to focus a lot less on editing my students' writing. As I'll share with you later on in the microcourse, my students had a different idea about that. So for me, as I moved through and had read these different studies, it started to change the way I was thinking about feedback in some ways. I realized that I wanted to be, I was glad that it seemed that teachers' comments did matter, and it raised questions for me about which comments I was making were helping students and how students were responding to these different kinds of comments, which comments were not as helpful and maybe I didn't need to spend as much time giving them. Was I giving comments that were creating issues for my students, that they didn't understand them, or they were contradictory and students weren't sure what or how to revise in response to the comments that I was giving? I realized that I didn't want to take over authorship of my students' writing. I wanted them to be authors. One, because I wanted them to take on that identity. I wanted them to learn from doing writing, and part of it was time. I didn't have time to be the author of 150 essays. And then last, as I mentioned, I realized that I didn't want to focus so much on editing that my students began to think that that's what writing was, was on being correct, because I was worried actually that too early and too much of a focus on editing was going to keep my students from developing ideas in the ways that I wanted them to develop them. So it was in response to these kind of questions and what I was learning from the research that I started to analyze the kinds of comments that I was giving my students and trying to understand what kinds of comments I was doing so that I could later understand what kinds of comments were having what kinds of effects on my students' writing. And I ended up developing a list of roles that I was seeing myself comment from. And that's what we are going to look at in part 3.